This topic has always fascinated me. True horror stories that people have lived through right after moving into their new homes. You know, those moments when what's supposed to be a fresh start turns into something utterly terrifying. Before we dive into it, I want to give a quick shout out to Betway for sponsoring today's video. If you enjoy sports betting, Betway's platform is incredibly user-friendly, and they often have some pretty generous welcome bonuses if you're new. Just check them out if you're interested. Now, let me take you to the beginning of one such story, something that really stuck with me because it's a reminder that sometimes the scariest things happen when you least expect them. Picture this. A family moves into what they thought was their dream home. It's their first night there, and everything should be perfect. New house, new memories, a fresh start. But instead, things go horribly wrong. This family, let's call them the Reynolds, had been searching for months. They finally found a charming old house in a quiet neighborhood, the kind with creaky wooden floors and big bay windows that caught the morning sun just right. The deal was sealed, and after moving all their belongings, they were ready to settle in. But the moment they stepped inside, something felt off. Not immediately, not in a way you could point to, but just an unshakable feeling that something wasn't quite right. The first night was supposed to be about unpacking a few boxes and getting some rest. Instead, it became a night full of unease. The house was unusually cold, even though the thermostat was set to a comfortable temperature. The air felt thick, heavy, almost as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The children were restless, clutching their blankets tighter than usual. The parents tried to ignore it, chalking it up to first-night jitters. As the night deepened, strange noises began to creep in. At first, it was subtle, a faint creaking here, a soft thud there. But then came the whispering. Not the sort of whispering you might expect from the wind outside or the house settling. This was different. It was faint, like a secret being passed just out of earshot. The Reynolds could hear it softly, almost like someone was murmuring from inside the walls. At first, they told themselves it was their imagination. Old houses made noises, right? Pipes clicked, floors creaked. But the whispers didn't fade. Instead, they grew more distinct, more purposeful. It felt like the house was trying to tell them something, but in a language just beyond comprehension. The words weren't clear, but the tone was unmistakably menacing. The parents huddled together, trying to comfort their kids, but even the youngest seemed unsettled. Their usual bedtime stories and lullabies felt hollow against the backdrop of those eerie murmurs. Sleep was impossible. The whispers seemed to echo in every room, following them, growing louder in the dead of night. The next morning, the family was exhausted and on edge. They joked about selling the house before moving in properly, but deep down, they were terrified. What was lurking behind those walls? Why had no one mentioned these strange sounds when they bought the place? They decided to investigate, hoping to find a logical explanation. Faulty pipes, maybe, or old wiring. But as they searched, they found nothing unusual. The house was structurally sound. No signs of animals nesting inside the walls. No drafts that could create strange noises. It was as if the whispers had no source at all. Yet the feeling of being watched, of something unseen lurking just beyond the edges of perception, remained. That night, the whispers returned with a vengeance. They weren't just murmurs now. They sounded like voices, urgent, demanding, and angry. The family could make out fragments of words like leave, gone, and danger. The atmosphere in the house turned oppressive, the air thick with dread. The kids refused to sleep in their rooms, clinging to their parents for comfort. The Reynolds tried everything, turning on every light, playing music to drown out the whispers, even sleeping in the living room together. Nothing helped. The house seemed alive with a dark presence that refused to be ignored. The family's joy about their new home was quickly replaced by fear and uncertainty. At one point, the father decided to record the sounds on his phone. When he played it back, the whispers were faint but definitely there. It was chilling to hear voices when the house was supposed to be empty and silent. Yet, no one else could see anything unusual. The neighbors were polite but distant, and no one had any stories about the house. The Reynolds felt trapped, caught between wanting to stay in the home they had worked so hard for and the overwhelming fear that something sinister was taking hold. They began to question their own sanity, wondering if the stress of moving had finally pushed them over the edge. But deep down, they knew this was something else. Something far darker than stress or imagination. They had moved into a house with secrets, and those secrets were waking up, right beneath their feet, whispering from the walls, and waiting for the family to listen. This was just the start of what would become a nightmare they couldn't have prepared for, a chilling reminder that sometimes, the scariest part of moving into a new home isn't the packing or the unpacking. It's what you find inside that you never expected. I've always been drawn to stories about moving into a new home and suddenly realizing that things aren't as they seem. Before we get into this next part, I want to thank Betway for sponsoring this video. If you're into sports betting or just want a fun way to try your luck, Betway offers a smooth platform and some solid welcome bonuses for new users. Definitely worth checking out if you want to add a little excitement to your day. Now, picking up where we left off with the Reynolds family. After that first night filled with eerie whispers and an overwhelming sense of dread, things only got stranger. They had hoped the unsettling noises would fade away, maybe be chalked up to old house quirks, but instead, those whispers evolved into something far more disturbing. A young couple, the Reynolds, had moved into a charming old house, the kind that looks like a postcard from the outside. But the moment they settled in, strange things started happening. At first, the noises were just faint whispers coming from the walls late at night. Nothing you could clearly make out, more like faint murmurs that raised the hairs on the back of your neck. They tried to explain it logically. Maybe the house was settling, or the wind was sneaking through cracks. Maybe old plumbing pipes were causing the sounds. But the whispers didn't act like normal noises. They were rhythmic, almost deliberate, and sometimes seemed to form words. The couple would lie awake at night, trying to listen, straining to catch even a hint of meaning. But the more they listened, the more it felt like the house was trying to speak directly to them. The whispers weren't random. They were insistent and persistent. Sometimes, it was as if multiple voices spoke at once, overlapping in a way that was impossible to understand but impossible to ignore. It was a low hum, a symphony of secrets the walls were desperate to share. At first, the couple tried to dismiss it as their imagination or nerves. Moving is stressful, after all, but the whispering grew louder, more urgent. It wasn't the subtle creaks or groans of an old home anymore. It was an unnerving presence that filled the silence with something sinister. The voices seemed to echo through the house, bouncing off the walls and growing stronger in the dead of night. They tried to pinpoint the source, walking from room to room, pressing their ears against the plaster, but the whispers seemed to move, always just out of reach. It was as if the entire house was alive, breathing secrets through its very foundation. Sometimes, the family caught fragments of words, soft, indistinct syllables that sounded like warnings or cries for help. But the meaning was always elusive. The couple's nights turned restless. Sleep became a luxury they couldn't afford. Their minds raced with fear and confusion, wondering if they had made a terrible mistake. The children were scared too, clinging to their parents and refusing to stay in their rooms alone. The house, once filled with hope and promise, now felt like a prison. They tried everything to get some relief. Night lights, music, even white noise machines, but nothing could drown out the whispering. It was always there, just beneath the surface, filling the air with a cold, unnatural energy. The couple even considered moving out, but the idea of abandoning their dream home without answers felt impossible. One evening, they invited a trusted friend over to see if someone else could hear what they were experiencing. As the house grew quiet, the whispers began again, soft, urgent, and chilling. Their friend pressed an ear to the wall and nodded, confirming they could hear the faint voices too. That validation was both a relief and a terrifying confirmation. The Reynolds began to keep a journal of the strange occurrences, noting the times when the whispering was most intense. It seemed to follow a pattern, mostly late at night, just as the house settled into silence. Sometimes, the voices seemed almost conversational, as if entities trapped within the walls were trying to reach out, begging to be heard. They even tried calling local historians and neighbors, hoping to uncover any past tragedies or stories tied to the house. But no one had any explanations. The house's history was clean on paper, but the atmosphere told a different story. It was as if the secrets were buried deep beneath the surface, hidden in the very fabric of the home. As days passed, the whispers started to affect the family's daily lives. They became jumpy, easily startled by the smallest sounds. The once warm, inviting house now felt cold and hostile. The parents debated whether to bring in paranormal experts, but hesitation and fear held them back. What if the house was already too far gone? What if acknowledging the presence made things worse? One night, the whispers escalated to a point where they could no longer be ignored. They filled the rooms with a cacophony of voices, some pleading, others angry. The family huddled together, feeling overwhelmed and frightened. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, the house itself vibrating with some unseen force. The couple tried to communicate back, speaking softly into the silence, asking what it wanted or why it was there. But the voices only responded with more whispers, unintelligible yet filled with anguish. It was as if the house was haunted not just by spirits, but by sorrow, pain, and unresolved stories trapped in time. In the days that followed, the family noticed other subtle changes. Objects felt heavier, shadows seemed to flicker just beyond the corner of their eyes, and the temperature dropped inexplicably in certain areas. The whispering was now a constant presence, a soundtrack to their lives that they couldn't escape. The Reynolds realized they were living with something much darker than a creaky old house, something that wanted their attention, something that wouldn't let them go quietly. It was a chilling reminder that sometimes, the walls we build to protect ourselves carry the echoes of the past, and those echoes can be louder and more terrifying than we ever imagined. This chapter in their lives was just beginning, and the whispers were only the first sign of the horrors yet to come. The story of the Reynolds family never ceases to haunt me. And before we get deeper into what they experienced, I want to thank Betway for sponsoring this video. If you enjoy sports betting or just want to try your luck with a platform that's easy to use and offers some solid welcome bonuses, Betway is a great choice. Now, let's continue with where we left off, because things for the Reynolds were about to get even more unsettling. After enduring nights filled with whispering voices seeping through the walls, the family started to notice something else. Personal belongings began disappearing. At first, it was small things, keys misplaced, a favorite toy vanished, or a jacket missing from the coat rack. They assumed it was the usual chaos that comes with moving into a new home, but as time went on, the missing items piled up in a way that felt deliberate. What made it worse was that these things didn't just go missing. They often reappeared in odd places. A child's shoe might be found tucked inside a kitchen cabinet, or a wallet left on the dresser would turn up in the basement. It was as if someone, or something, was playing a cruel game, toying with the family's sense of security. Alongside the vanishing belongings, strange cold spots began to appear throughout the house. These weren't the normal chilly drafts you might expect in an old home. No, these cold spots were localized, intense patches of freezing air that seemed to follow them from room to room. Standing in one of these areas sent a shiver down their spine, and the hair on their arms would stand on end. The family became increasingly anxious, especially at night. One evening, the father was walking down the hallway when he caught a glimpse of something moving out of the corner of his eye. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, but then he saw a shadowy figure dart across the room and disappear into the darkness. His heart pounded as he called out, but there was no response, just silence and the lingering cold. Other times, the family heard footsteps echoing through the hallways, even when everyone was accounted for and the house was empty. These footsteps were heavy, deliberate, and sometimes slow, as if someone was pacing or lurking nearby. The uncertainty was maddening. Who, or what, was in their home, and why? Despite the fear, the Reynolds family tried to maintain some normalcy. They debated installing security cameras, hoping to capture evidence of these strange happenings and maybe finally get some answers. But then doubt crept in. What if the cameras picked up something even more terrifying? What if watching the recordings only deepened their fear or confirmed their worst nightmares? The emotional toll was immense. Arguments sparked over how to handle the situation, and sleepless nights wore down their resilience. The children became withdrawn, afraid to explore the rooms alone. The parents felt trapped between protecting their family and the overwhelming urge to leave. One night, the mother awoke to the sound of a soft thud, followed by the unmistakable creak of a door opening somewhere in the house. She reached for her phone but hesitated, unsure if she wanted to confront whatever was causing these disturbances. The house seemed to hold its breath as she moved cautiously down the hallway, every step echoing in the stillness. As she turned a corner, a shadow slipped past her vision, disappearing into the living room. Her heart raced as she flicked on the lights, but the room was empty. Nothing was out of place, yet the sense of an unseen presence lingered like a fog. She called her husband, who arrived moments later, and together they scoured the house, finding no signs of intrusion. The family began to suspect that they were not alone, that the house harbored something beyond their understanding. The strange cold spots, the missing items, the footsteps and shadows, all pointed to an unseen occupant who wasn't ready to reveal itself fully, but made its presence known in unmistakable ways. In their desperation, the Reynolds turned to local experts, hoping that someone with experience in the paranormal could shed light on their plight. The experts listened carefully, took notes, and recommended setting up discreet cameras and audio recorders to capture any unusual activity. They warned, though, that documenting such phenomena could be emotionally exhausting, and sometimes the truth was harder to face than the unknown. Despite the warnings, the family agreed. They wanted proof, not just for themselves, but for anyone who might help them understand what was happening. The first few nights with cameras brought nothing but silence, which was a relief but also unnerving. It felt like the presence was watching, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. Then, one night, the security footage caught movements that defied explanation. Shadows would flicker across rooms where no one was supposed to be, and objects appeared to shift slightly from one frame to the next. Audio recordings picked up faint whispers and footsteps, just as the family had described. Watching the footage was both validating and terrifying. It confirmed that they were experiencing something real, something beyond the natural world. But it also raised more questions. Who or what was haunting their home? What did it want? And was it growing stronger? The emotional strain became unbearable. The Reynolds family found themselves walking on eggshells, afraid to disturb the entity, but also terrified of what might happen if they didn't. The house, once a symbol of hope and new beginnings, had become a source of constant fear and uncertainty. The children stopped playing freely. The parents were exhausted from sleepless nights filled with anxiety, and the sense of safety they once enjoyed was shattered. The family realized they needed to make difficult decisions soon, but for now, they were trapped in a home that no longer felt like theirs. As the days wore on, the strange occurrences continued with no sign of abating. The missing items, the cold spots, the footsteps, and the shadows were constant reminders that something was living with them, something unseen but undeniably present. The Reynolds were caught in a nightmare they couldn't wake from, haunted not just by a house, but by whatever secrets it held deep within its walls. This was no longer just a story about a family moving into a new home. It was a story about what happens when the past refuses to be buried and the unknown refuses to stay hidden. The Reynolds' journey was far from over, and the horrors they faced were only beginning to unravel. This story has been haunting me for weeks now, and before I continue, I want to remind you that Betway is sponsoring this video. If you're into sports betting or just want to try a reliable platform with great bonuses, Betway is definitely worth a look. Now, let me tell you about what happened next to the Reynolds family and another homeowner named Mark, whose experience adds another layer to this chilling saga. Mark had recently bought a house not far from where the Reynolds lived. His move was supposed to be a fresh start, a bigger place with more space and privacy. But soon after moving in, Mark began noticing strange electrical issues that made him uneasy. Power outages would happen randomly, sometimes lasting only a few seconds, but enough to reset his clocks and disrupt his appliances. Other times, lights flickered violently or dimmed inexplicably. At first, Mark blamed it on faulty wiring or the old electrical system in the house. But when a professional electrician inspected the property, he found nothing wrong. The circuits were sound, and no signs of damage or what could explain the surges and outages. Mark's unease grew, especially since these electrical anomalies seemed to follow a pattern, often occurring late at night or when he was alone. One evening, frustrated and curious, Mark decided to inspect his basement. It was a cluttered space, filled with boxes and old tools left by the previous owners. While searching for the electrical panel, he noticed a loose wooden panel near the back wall, partially hidden behind some shelves. It looked like it hadn't been disturbed in years. Driven by a mix of curiosity and unease, Mark pried the panel open. Behind it was a narrow crawl space, dark and cramped, barely tall enough to sit up in. As he shone his flashlight inside, he saw old belongings scattered about, pieces of worn clothing, tattered books, and a strange assortment of objects that seemed out of place. What caught his attention most were the eerie symbols scrawled on the walls in what looked like charcoal or some dark paint. These symbols weren't random doodles. They looked like cryptic markings, some resembling ancient sigils or protective signs, others more sinister and unrecognizable. Mark felt a chill run down his spine as he realized someone had been living here, or at least had spent a significant amount of time in this hidden space. His heart pounding, Mark explored further and discovered a second hidden door inside the crawlspace. Unlike the wooden panel he had just opened, this door was metal, heavy, and locked tight. The presence of this concealed room inside the crawlspace raised alarm bells in his mind. Who had built it and why? What was kept behind that door? Mark's unease turned to fear. The idea that someone might have been secretly occupying part of his home, unnoticed, was terrifying. He wondered if the previous owners knew about it, or if it had been deliberately hidden from them. The symbols on the wall suggested something ritualistic or supernatural, but Mark wasn't sure what to believe. He immediately contacted the previous owners to ask about the crawlspace and the locked door. Their responses were vague and evasive, with no clear explanation. They suggested it might be an old storm shelter or a storage area, but refused to provide more details. That only made Mark more suspicious. Unable to resist his growing curiosity, Mark decided to hire a locksmith to open the metal door. When the door finally clicked open, the sight inside was chilling. It was a small, dark room with signs that someone had been living there recently. A makeshift bed, scattered food containers, and even personal items that didn't match anything Mark owned. The walls were covered with more of those strange symbols, some smeared and faded, others freshly drawn. There were faded photographs pinned to the walls, old black and white pictures of unknown people, some with eyes scratched out or faces blurred. It felt like a shrine or a lair, a place where someone had hidden away from the world. Panic set in. Mark felt violated, as if his privacy had been shattered. Who had been living under his house? For how long? And why had they left so abruptly? The mysterious symbols and photographs suggested something more than just a squatter. It hinted at something darker, perhaps connected to the supernatural disturbances both he and the Reynolds family were experiencing nearby. Mark quickly sealed the door and reported the situation to the police. They promised to investigate but seemed skeptical, offering little reassurance. Meanwhile, Mark took extra precautions, installing new locks, reinforcing windows, and setting up security cameras around the perimeter. That night, the house felt alive with tension. Mark and his family heard banging on the metal door from the crawlspace, accompanied by tapping on the windows. Glass shattered in one spot, and they could swear they saw shadows moving just beyond the camera's view. The police were called again, but found no evidence of an intruder. The previous owners stopped returning Mark's calls, leaving him to face the growing fear alone. The electrical surges continued, sometimes accompanied by strange smells, burning incense, or something metallic and sour. It was as if the house itself was warning him to leave. Mark's experience added a terrifying dimension to what the Reynolds family was going through. Both homes, isolated yet connected by the strange forces at play, had secrets hidden deep within their walls. Electrical disturbances, hidden rooms, cryptic symbols. These were more than coincidences. They were signs of something lurking just beneath the surface. Meanwhile, the Reynolds continued to live with the whispering voices and unseen footsteps. The missing items, cold spots, and shadows were constant reminders that their home was far from ordinary. But now, with Mark's story, the picture became clearer. These houses were not just haunted. They were battlegrounds for something ancient and malevolent. The families were trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape, each revelation pulling them deeper into a web of fear and uncertainty. The houses held their secrets tightly, revealing them only to those brave enough or desperate enough to look. Mark's discovery of the hidden crawl space and the sinister room behind the metal door raised more questions than answers. Who had lived there? What rituals had taken place? Why did the signs point to something supernatural rather than just a squatter? As the nights grew darker and the disturbances escalated, both families faced a grim reality. Their homes were far from safe, and the horrors they had uncovered were only the beginning of a much larger and more terrifying story. This story has taken me to some dark places, and before we get into this final part, I want to thank Betway for sponsoring today's video. If you're into sports betting or just want a user-friendly platform with great bonuses, Betway is one of the best out there. Now, let me share with you the chilling encounter with a neighbor that pushed one homeowner to her breaking point and changed everything. Lisa had recently moved into a quiet neighborhood, hoping for a fresh start away from the chaos of city life. The house was beautiful, with a large yard and friendly-looking neighbors, or so she thought. One of those neighbors, Walter, caught her attention almost immediately. On the surface, Walter seemed like a typical older man, but there was something off about him, an intensity in his gaze that made Lisa uneasy. At first, Walter's behavior was odd but subtle. He would linger near the property line, watching Lisa and her family with an unsettling focus. Sometimes he'd drop by unannounced, under the guise of casual conversation, but his questions felt invasive rather than friendly. Lisa tried to be polite, hoping Walter would take the hint and back off, but his visits grew more frequent. As days passed, Walter's behavior escalated. He began showing up late at night, standing outside Lisa's windows, sometimes tapping on the glass. Lisa's children were frightened, refusing to play in the yard when Walter was around. She tried speaking with him directly, asking him to respect their privacy, but his responses were cryptic and disturbing. One evening, Walter confronted Lisa in her driveway. His tone was aggressive, and he accused her of taking something that belonged to him. Lisa was confused and alarmed, but before she could respond, Walter's demeanor shifted to something darker, more dangerous. He pulled a knife, claiming she had taken his son and threatening her to stay away. Lisa's heart pounded as she backed away, but she didn't run. Instead, she grabbed a nearby object for defense and struggled with Walter until she managed to disarm him. She called the police immediately, and when they arrived, Walter was detained, but the damage was done. Lisa was shaken to her core. The experience left Lisa paranoid and fearful in her own home. She installed new locks, invested in security cameras, and even stayed with friends for a few nights to recover. The neighborhood that once seemed peaceful was now a place of nightmares. Lisa realized that sometimes, the scariest threats aren't from unknown spirits or haunted walls. They come from the people living next door. Reflecting on these terrifying encounters, it's clear how vulnerable we can feel when our sense of safety is shattered, whether by unseen forces in a home or by a neighbor's menacing presence. For Lisa and the families like the Reynolds and Mark, these experiences forced life-changing decisions, choices about where to live, who to trust, and how to protect what matters most. The stories remind us all that the dream of a new home can quickly turn into a nightmare, and sometimes, the only way to find peace is to walk away from the place that no longer feels like home.